For when we were rehearsing that piece this morning before worship, Fred shared that it comes from a genre of music I find fascinating. What's that called again?
Renaissance, Tudor?
Tudor, Renaissance, but there was a name, it was a type of dance.
Oh,
Pavan. So picture all of us, instead of wearing choir robes, wearing Henry VIII and his ladies' skirts and billowy trousers and everything else, and dancing very anyway, having that mental image really helps when you're singing something like that. But we don't have those costumes yet. Amazon has them on the way. When I was very young, just 4 or 5 years old, in church, I would always sit with my mom in the very front pew. And my big brothers, who were 6 and 7 years older than I was, they got to sit up in the balcony with all the older kids and the adolescents. I did not think that was fair. I was very envious. Fred was the minister, and by the time he started preaching, I'd be sitting with my mom, but I would get tired and I would slip off my shoes and I would lay my head on my mom's lap and I would stretch out on the pew, and quite often I would rest my feet up on the armrest of the pew, and then I would take a little nap during my dad's sermon. Now, in those days, I only had one pair of socks that were appropriate and nice enough to wear to church, and they were bright red. So that meant every Sunday, if you were sitting behind my mom, you would see the back of her head, and to her left, a little pair of feet wearing red socks sticking out into the center aisle. And one Sunday, I'll never forget this, one Sunday an older man came up to my mom as the service was ending and people were filing out of the sanctuary, and he said, "Mrs. Green, with all due respect, enough is enough. You have got to stop letting Dave put his feet up on the pew like that with those red socks. It is a distraction. It is not proper. You just can't do that in church." And the man strode away, and my mom did not say a word, but I could tell she was not happy. My mom was very proper and polite, but when she got mad, she would clench her teeth and squint her eyes and whisper words to herself that I did not quite understand the meaning of. Now, the next Sunday morning rolled around and I was ready for church. My mom came into my room and handed me something, and she said, "Here, I bought these for you and I want you to wear them to church today." It was a brand new pair of socks and they were bright purple. And that man from the week before never said another word, as far as I know. But I still think of that guy whenever I hear a variation of the phrase, "You can't do that in church." And over the course of my ministry, I've heard that phrase a lot. I've even said it myself. And maybe because I've said it myself, that's why I have some sympathy for the Pharisees in our scripture passage today. Pharisees often get a bad rap, and I think that's unfair. It is true, some Pharisees conspired against Jesus, ultimately to have him killed. But as a group, they were not horrible people. They were not villains. For instance, there was a Pharisee named Nicodemus who was genuinely interested in Jesus had to say. And after Jesus had been executed, Nicodemus even helped out with the burial arrangements. In first century Judea, the Pharisees played a really important role. This was a time when Jews were going through a fair amount of turmoil and confusion. Now, we have to remember this was long before any modern concepts like the separation of church and state ever crossed anyone's minds. People lived with their religious identity deeply intertwined with everything else that they did. Now, going way back into history, the Jews, whenever their country was not occupied by force, periodically that happened, But when it was not, it had ideally been governed by a monarch who was believed to be a king who was chosen by God. And so that meant that king was not only a political and a military head of state, but a religious leader, or example at least, as well. Now, if a king was successful and popular, that was understood as a sign of satisfaction and approval of that king. Even when Israel was under, though, the control of a foreign nation, the king was still an observant Jew who everyone expected to follow Jewish religious laws and customs. Now, whenever the monarch, the king, strayed too far afield from following God's will, there often arose a prophet to call that ruler to account. Or sometimes even an armed rebellion would rise up. Fast forward to the time Judea effectively became a province of the Roman Empire, about 60 years before Jesus was born. The religious role of any Jewish monarch who was acceptable to Rome had been greatly diminished. All the Romans really wanted was someone locally who could govern the territory effectively. The Romans promoted a very cosmopolitan and religiously diverse society. And so, to get along with the Romans, a local ruler in any Roman province like Judea could not afford to be a religious zealot. Now, the Romans usually respected the local religious practices in any territory that they occupied, but only as long as no one started any trouble. So, to stay in power, a king would be more of a strictly civil rather than a religious symbol of authority. That meant that for the average Jewish citizen, you had to look elsewhere for any kind of religious leadership. And again, in those days, the average person in Judea did not make distinctions between their religious life and anything else in their lives, like you and I so often do. Now, our faith certainly informs our behavior. We're motivated to pursue justice and peace and to love our neighbor. We're inspired to believe that as we are loved by God, we share that love. At the same time, we usually don't consider our religious faith when we're picking out the groceries that we buy, or when we think about the type of career we might pursue, or the style of clothing we wear, whether it be Renaissance or modern, or the neighborhood that we live in. But in first century Judea, all those things were saturated with religious meaning that really shaped your very identity. So by the time of Jesus, to provide some guidance on all of that, he had some options. There were still the priests, and these were the guys in charge of the religious observances and the seasonal festivals being held at the big temple in Jerusalem. But different religious groups with different agendas had already sprouted up. Now, the scribes, they were teachers and leaders who they were absolute experts in Jewish law, and they could draft legal documents. And some of the scribes also happened to be priests. So you had to go to those guys to settle legal disputes, get things like birth certificates, marriage certificates, and so on. The Sadducees, they were a social political party, and they were the wealthy and influential aristocrats of the day. Many of the Sadducees were merchants, and some of them were also priests. So the Sadducees represented the social conservative elites, and they had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Even if the status quo meant being okay with the Roman Empire and the kind of culture that the Roman Empire promoted. Now, the Pharisees can also be thought of as a social political party, but really, it's more fair to say they were more of a reform movement. They were largely working class, the Pharisees were, and they believed that the Sadducees had gone too far in accommodating the Roman way of life. Pharisees were also experts in Jewish law. So because Pharisees were more from the masses of the working class, a lot of people looked to the Pharisees for guidance on how to go about their daily lives. Now, all of these groups, the scribes, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, they vied with each other for political and religious influence. A lot of intrigue going on there, and for the popular support of the public. And all of them believed that their particular worldview and way of being faithful was the only right way. In other words, each of those groups had their own way of saying, you can't do that in church. But in the context of that day and time, when religion, remember, saturated every aspect of your life, that was more like saying, you can't do that, period. And now into this mix, Jesus appeared on the scene. And by what he said and did, he proceeded to challenge everybody's concept of what was acceptable and what was not. Now, one way to think about that was, on the one hand, Jesus was a whole lot like the Pharisees, who were reformers. Like the Pharisees, Jesus pointed people back to the very basic ideals that were found in Jewish law. Like the Pharisees, Jesus was fond of quoting chapter and verse of the Hebrew scriptures to support his teachings, such as love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus did not come up with that. That's in the Old Testament. He believed in justice and being righteous. On the other hand, much like the Sadducees, Jesus was multicultural. He was welcoming people and ideas from beyond Judaism. He interacted with and he helped people who were outside the boundaries of the Jewish community, and he reinterpreted Jewish laws and customs to accommodate all of those outsiders coming into their country. He didn't care if you were a Roman, or if you were a ritually unclean leper, or a person accused of a crime, or a social outcast of some kind. He cared about you as a person. Well, like any of the religious authorities, including the scribes and the priests, Jesus was well versed in Jewish traditions and laws, as I said, and he practiced them himself, and he could hold his own in any debate. And because of all of that, because of his deep knowledge and the inclusive nature of his actions, because he spoke and he behaved in ways that refused to fit into any kind of neat and tidy category, he represented a threat to every form of organized religion. And again, it wasn't religion itself in those days that Jesus was questioning. It was life itself. It was how you navigated through all aspects of life, how you thought about yourself and how you regarded others, how you awakened to the holiness within yourself and how that was made real in all of your relationships, how you thought about your connection to God and how you saw God in your neighbor or in a stranger, or in a person you might disagree with, or in someone whom you've been taught all your life was your enemy, or simply unworthy. So in speaking and in acting in ways that shined a light on that way of being, Jesus threatened those whose agenda was to enforce and grow their own power and influence. To them, Jesus was tearing down all the walls. He was leading people astray down the garden path. He was, in effect, saying that organized religion, as everyone knew it, was really getting in the way. He was demonstrating that religion, in the way it was so often practiced and enforced, was not a pathway, but an obstacle to understanding and embracing a new way of experiencing life. And it is what Jesus called eternal life. Now, suffice it to say, that put Jesus on a collision course with people like the Pharisees, some of whom decided that Jesus needed to be challenged, to be put in his place, to be discredited in the eyes of the public as a charlatan, and even to be silenced. So the passage we heard today from Mark, we can actually think of as just another example of this. And it's really two examples. The first story is about a group of Pharisees who objected to Jesus and his disciples plucking grain and eating it on the Sabbath. First of all, that was a very questionable interpretation of Jewish law to say that doing that went against the law. But the main thing is those particular Pharisees were already so enraged by what Jesus had been going around saying and doing, they were just looking for any excuse at all they could find to discredit him in public. The second story takes place that very same day when Jesus visits a synagogue and asks the same group of Pharisees if they think that it would be improper, if it's against the Jewish law for someone to be healed on the Sabbath. Because right there in that church, there just so happened to be a man with a debility, with a withered hand, something that very likely prevented him from being able to earn a decent living. Pharisees, well, they just don't have an answer for that. And that makes Jesus angry. He's furious. Obviously, they don't think it's proper because, again, in their interpretation of what is allowed and what's not, of what you can really do in church, this does not fit. And that is so infuriating and absurd to Jesus. So he heals the man right in front of them and everybody else. And to the Pharisees, that is a slap in the face. Jesus is not only saying, he is demonstrating in front of a crowd that if that's your concept of religion, then your religion is worthless. It's as good as dead. Jesus is saying, what I am showing you here and now goes beyond your definition of religion. You can tell me all day long that you can't do that in church, but if this is your idea of church, then you can have it. Because what I'm all about goes beyond church of any kind. It goes beyond organized religion of any kind. It's about simple human decency and justice and loving kindness. It is about freedom from the limits that you are attempting to impose on a loving God whose love has no limits. Now, I'll admit there are times when I am frustrated by organized religion, by many of the ways that it's manifested in our world. It's easy enough to find fault in expressions of religion that appear to be overly controlling or that deny the rights of women or that condemn people because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. I'm not a fan of any organized religion that wants to ban books or that denies science or that's to create laws that impose a particular version of morality on everybody else. Theocracies just never turn out well. What's more difficult is to look in the mirror and ask, am I ever guilty of saying you can't do that in church? Am I ever a kind of Pharisee who gets uncomfortable because my view of what God is capable of doing and who God is capable of embracing is being challenged? Am I someone who 2,000 years ago in Judea would have been an avid follower and a big fan of Jesus because of his liberating vision of what it means to be human and how we can live in peace with each other? Or would I have been a member of a mob chanting, "Crucify him," because he was just going a bit too far with all that talk about God's love? Now, don't get me wrong, I am a Christian. But I've come to believe that what it means to be a Christian has changed for me. It once meant obeying a set of rules that were just baked in. It once meant compliance and uniformity. It once meant that, well, some people are in and other people are out. It once meant there were some things you could not do in church. But now, and this may sound funny coming from a minister, but I'm a Christian who increasingly does not think in terms of Christianity even as a religion. I'm a Christian in that I do my best, not always successfully, mind you, but I do my best to simply follow the way of Jesus as I understand that way. It's a way of awakening every day and being open to new ways of seeing the world and my relationships, of seeking to always be kinder, more compassionate, more helpful. It's a way of not thinking that I have all the answers, but to keep on questioning. It's being skeptical of those who claim to have every answer. Mostly it's a way of loving as I have been so loved. And because it's about the loving holiness that's within every person, no exceptions, it's always growing and expanding and never static. And that means, do me a favor, if I ever appear to forget that, and you ever hear me say, you can't do that in church, please look me in the eye and say, oh, yes, we can. Amen.